You are the Queen's physician. You've seen death in 100 forms, but you have never seen this, and you have no idea how to treat it. You watch, helpless, as your Queen's skin begins to turn black, a strange decay that spreads while she is still alive. You see her belly, swollen with the phantom child she so desperately believes in, and you must stand by and listen as she whispers lullabies to empty air. Your medical books have no name for this. The scent of rot hangs in the royal bedchamber, yet the patient lives. You look at this broken woman, lost in a tragic fever dream, and struggle to see the monarch they call Bloody Mary, the tyrant who sent hundreds to the fire. And with a dread that goes beyond science, you realize you are not treating a disease. You are witnessing a soul so poisoned by a lifetime of betrayal that it is now devouring the body from within. You see the horrifying end of her story. But to understand the monster, you must first meet the girl. How did England's most adored princess become a pariah in her own court, forced to act as a servant to the infant child of the woman who destroyed her life? How did that same humiliated girl then inspire an army of thousands to rise up and demand she be crowned queen? And what truly drove her to burn hundreds at the stake? Was it unshakable faith? Or was it the consuming madness of a woman betrayed by her father, her husband, and finally, by her own body? Let's start with the most twisted birth announcement in royal history. While most parents celebrate their newborn, Henry VIII looked at baby Mary and saw his greatest failure. She was female. But here's where it gets really dark. This wasn't just disappointment. This was the culmination of years of dead babies, failed pregnancies, and a king who was starting to believe God was punishing him. The really disturbing part? Baby Mary's nursery was literally haunted by the ghosts of her dead siblings. February 18th, 1516, should have been a day of pure celebration. Catherine of Aragon had finally delivered a living child at Greenwich Palace. The bells rang across England, bonfires were lit, and free wine flowed in the streets of London. But wait, it gets worse. Behind the palace walls, Henry's face fell when they told him, "Your Majesty has a healthy daughter." Here's what most people don't realize. Before Mary drew her first breath, her mother had already buried at least 6 babies. 6 tiny coffins, 6 sets of baby clothes that would never be worn. 6 times Henry thought he'd have his heir. The palace servants whispered about the curse on the royal nursery. Some of these babies lived just long enough to be baptized before dying. One particularly tragic case was Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, who survived 52 days in 1511, just long enough for his parents to fall in love with him before he died. The truly disturbing part was how they tried to spin Mary's birth as a victory. Henry told the Venetian ambassador, "We are both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, sons will follow." Imagine being so unwanted that your own father's birth announcement for you was basically better luck next time. But the psychological damage went deeper than just disappointment. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Mary spent her early years surrounded by reminders of death. The royal nursery still contained items prepared for her dead siblings. Cradles that had briefly held dying infants. Christening gowns worn by babies who didn't survive the week. The nurses who cared for Mary were the same ones who had watched her brothers die. Can you imagine the psychological impact? Every toy, every piece of furniture, every lullaby came with the ghost of a dead sibling attached. But here's what's even more messed up. They started planning Mary's marriage when she was 2 years old. Not 16, not 12, TWO. In 1518, they literally dressed this toddler up as a bride for a betrothal ceremony to the French Dauphin. The French ambassador described how they carried her down the aisle because she couldn't walk in the heavy dress. They put a ring on her tiny finger that she immediately tried to eat. The whole court watched as this baby was essentially sold in a political contract she couldn't even understand. The ceremony itself was absolutely bonkers by modern standards. Cardinal Wolsey performed the betrothal as if it were an actual wedding. They made this 2-year-old repeat vows in Latin she couldn't possibly comprehend. When she got fussy and started crying, they bribed her with a golden apple to keep going. The French delegation actually wrote back saying the princess was very pretty and would make a suitable bride. They were reviewing a toddler like she was livestock at market. Here's where it gets even more twisted. This wasn't even her first engagement. When Mary was just 6 months old, they tried to betroth her to the Dauphin of France. Before her 2nd birthday, she'd been offered to the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Poland, and various Italian princes. Her body was literally state property from the moment she was born. Catherine of Aragon was desperate to protect her only surviving child, but she was fighting a losing battle. She knew Henry's affection for Mary was conditional on producing a male heir. Every month that passed without Catherine getting pregnant again made Mary's position more precarious. The Queen would spend hours in prayer, going on pilgrimages, consulting with doctors and astrologers, anything to give Henry the son that would secure Mary's position. The documented evidence shows Catherine's increasing desperation. She wrote to her father, Ferdinand of Spain, begging for prayers and holy relics that might help her conceive. She fasted until she fainted. She wore hair shirts under her royal robes as penance, all while trying to maintain the facade that everything was fine for little Mary's sake. Modern parents worry about putting too much pressure on gifted children. Medieval royalty literally sold their toddlers in marriage contracts. Today, we debate whether beauty pageants are appropriate for children. Tudor England put a 2-year-old through a wedding ceremony and called it diplomacy. Makes our modern helicopter parenting look positively hands-off by comparison. But being born female and being diplomatic currency was just the opening act of Mary's tragedy. The real nightmare started when her father met a woman named Anne Boleyn. And speaking of contracts, wait until you hear what happened when Mary's father decided to break the ultimate contract, his marriage to her mother. Because what came next would make even the most bitter modern divorce look like a peaceful, conscious uncoupling. But being born female was just the beginning of Mary's nightmare. At 17, she went from Princess of England to something far worse than a servant. She became a slave to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who destroyed her family. The psychological torture that followed was so precisely calculated it would make modern mean girls take notes. And the really sick part? This wasn't just casual cruelty. This was a systematic campaign to break Mary's spirit completely. Picture this. You're 17, you've been Princess of Wales your entire life, and suddenly your father declares you're not his legitimate daughter anymore. But wait, it gets worse. Not only are you suddenly a bastard in the eyes of the law, but you're ordered to join the household of your newborn half-sister, the baby your father had with his mistress-turned-new wife. The same woman who engineered your mother's downfall and your own destruction. The year was 1533, and the specific orders were designed for maximum humiliation. Mary wasn't just sent to live with Elizabeth, she was made a servant in the baby's household. Here's what most people don't realize. This wasn't like being demoted at work. This was like being CEO of a company, and then being forced to empty the trash cans for the janitor's baby, while the janitor laughs at you. Anne Boleyn's instructions to Lady Shelton, who ran Elizabeth's household, were explicitly cruel. She literally told her to slap and hit Mary for the cursed bastard she is, if she refused to acknowledge her new status. This wasn't a figure of speech. We have documented evidence of Mary being physically struck by servants who previously would have been executed for touching a princess. The daily humiliations were precisely choreographed. Mary had to stand while baby Elizabeth sat. She had to curtsy to an infant. She was forbidden from eating at the main table and had to take her meals with the lower servants. But here's the truly disturbing part. She had to empty Elizabeth's chamber pot. The Princess of Wales, who had been served by ladies-in-waiting since birth, was now handling the bodily waste of her replacement. You think your family dynamics are complicated? Mary had to watch servants dress Elizabeth in the jewels that used to be hers. The same coronet Mary wore as Princess of Wales now sat on a baby's head while Mary stood in the corner in a plain dress. Elizabeth's cradle was draped in cloth of gold while Mary slept on a simple bed in the servants' quarters. The psychological warfare went deeper than just material deprivation. Anne Boleyn would visit the household specifically to torment Mary. She would parade around in Catherine of Aragon's jewelry that should have been Mary's inheritance. She would loudly discuss how Elizabeth would marry great princes while Mary would be lucky to wed a minor gentleman. The really twisted thing? She would do this while forcing Mary to serve her wine. Here's what they don't teach you in school. Mary tried to resist at first. She refused to address Elizabeth as princess, insisting she was the only legitimate princess in England. The punishment was swift and brutal. They took away her remaining servants, leaving her to dress herself, something she'd never done in her life. They removed the furniture from her room, leaving just a straw mattress on the floor. They restricted her food to bread and water, when she was obstinate. Lady Shelton reported every act of defiance to Anne Boleyn, who seemed to take personal pleasure in devising new humiliations. When Mary fell ill, which happened frequently due to the stress and poor conditions, Anne suggested they just let her die. She actually wrote that Mary's death would be convenient for everyone. This wasn't hidden. Everyone at court knew the new queen wanted the former princess dead. The most heartbreaking part? Mary's mother Catherine was forbidden from seeing her. They were only 3 miles apart at one point, but Henry refused to let them meet. Catherine sent secret messages through sympathetic servants, telling Mary to stay strong, that this was a test from God. But imagine being 17, stripped of everything, physically abused, and unable to even hug your mother for comfort. Modern therapy would have a field day with this level of systematic abuse. We're talking about complete identity destruction. Everything Mary had been told about herself since birth was now being violently overwritten. She went from Your Highness to Lady Mary to just Mary to that bastard in the space of months. Servants who used to kneel to her now felt free to insult her to her face. The physical manifestations of trauma started quickly. Mary developed severe headaches that would plague her for life. Her periods became irregular and intensely painful, what we'd now recognize as stress-induced dysmenorrhea. She couldn't keep food down and lost so much weight that her clothes hung off her frame. But showing weakness only invited more cruelty from Anne Boleyn's supporters. Here's the really messed up part. This went on for 3 years. 3 years of daily humiliation, physical abuse, and psychological torture. Every single day, Mary had to navigate this minefield of degradation while maintaining some shred of dignity. She learned to keep her face blank when slapped. She learned to curtsy to a toddler without showing emotion. She learned to swallow rage and humiliation like it was her daily bread. Imagine being Kim Kardashian's daughter. Then suddenly you're scrubbing floors for her dad's new baby while the stepmom films you for humiliation content. Except instead of social media cancellation, the punishment for resistance was potential execution. Mary lived every day, knowing that one wrong word could lead to the Tower of London. But here's what's absolutely insane. This systematic breaking of Mary's spirit had an unexpected consequence. You can only push someone so far before they snap. And when Mary finally snapped, she didn't break down, she broke free. But Mary's transformation from victim to victor involved something even more shocking than anything Anne Boleyn could devise. She was about to command an army, and not just any army, 15,000 men ready to die for the bastard princess who'd been emptying chamber pots. After decades of abuse, something snapped in Mary. In 1553, this woman who'd been slapped around like a servant suddenly had 15,000 armed men ready to die for her. But the really twisted part? She did it all without social media, without a PR team, without anything except the sheer force of being the last legitimate Tudor standing. The transformation from victim to commander happened so fast it gave everyone whiplash, including Mary herself. Here's what most people don't realize about July 1553. England was in complete chaos. Edward VI, Mary's half-brother, was dying at 15 from what was probably tuberculosis. But wait, it gets worse. On his deathbed, this teenager was manipulated into changing the succession to skip both his sisters and name his cousin Lady Jane Grey as queen. The entire legitimate line of succession was being thrown out for a 16-year-old girl who didn't even want the throne. The truly disturbing part? Everyone expected Mary to just accept it. After all, she'd spent 20 years being humiliated and beaten down. She'd learned to curtsy to babies and empty chamber pots. Surely she'd just quietly disappear and let Jane Grey take the crown that was rightfully hers. That's where they miscalculated spectacularly. On July 10th, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen in London. Mary was at Hunsdon House when she got the news. Everyone expected her to flee to Spain or simply submit. Instead, she did something absolutely unhinged. She wrote a letter declaring herself the rightful queen and rode to Framlingham Castle in Suffolk to raise an army. A woman who'd been psychologically tortured for 2 decades suddenly decided she was done being a victim. Here's where it gets absolutely insane. When Mary arrived at Framlingham on July 12th, she had maybe a handful of loyal servants. By July 19th, just 1 week later, she had 15,000 armed supporters camped outside the castle walls. Nobles who had signed documents supporting Jane Grey were literally racing across England to kneel before Mary. The speed of the reversal was breathtaking. But here's what they don't teach you in school. This wasn't just about legitimacy. This was about decades of sympathy finally paying off. Every nobleman who arrived at Framlingham had heard the stories. How the legitimate princess had been forced to serve her bastard sister. How she'd been beaten by servants. How she'd maintained her dignity through unimaginable humiliation. Suddenly, supporting Mary wasn't just about law, it was about justice. The documented evidence from Framlingham is absolutely wild. Lords were arriving so fast they couldn't find places to camp. The Earl of Sussex showed up with his entire household guard. Sir Henry Jerningham brought 2,000 men. The Earl of Oxford abandoned Jane Grey mid-proclamation to ride to Mary. Ships in the harbour declared for Mary and trained their guns on London. It was like watching a viral movement happen in real time, except with actual swords and cavalry. You won't believe what happened next. Northumberland, who had engineered the whole Jane Grey plot, marched out of London with troops to capture Mary. But as he travelled, his army literally melted away. Soldiers deserted to join Mary. Towns that were supposed to supply him shut their gates. By the time he reached Cambridge, even his own officers were discussing switching sides. The man who thought he'd crushed Mary was watching his world collapse in real time. Meanwhile, at Framlingham, Mary was experiencing something she'd never known. Power. Real, tangible power. Men who wouldn't have acknowledged her as princess 3 years ago were now calling her Your Majesty. The same types of people who had slapped her were now kneeling in the mud, begging for her favour. The psychological whiplash must have been incredible. The really sick part? Mary handled it like she'd been commanding armies her whole life. She reviewed troops, consulted with military commanders, and planned the march to London. This woman who'd been isolated and abused for 20 years was suddenly making decisions that would determine England's future, and she was good at it. On July 19th, just 9 days after Jane was proclaimed Queen, the Privy Council in London realised the game was over. They declared for Mary and had Jane arrested. But here's what's really twisted. Mary hadn't fired a single shot. She'd won a civil war through sheer legitimacy and force of personality. The abused princess had become a conqueror, without a battle. The most insane moment came months later during Wyatt's rebellion. Thomas Wyatt raised 3,000 men and marched on London to prevent Mary's Spanish marriage. Everyone expected Mary to flee. Her councillors begged her to escape to Windsor. Instead, she rode to the Guildhall and gave a speech that would go down in history. Picture this scene. Rebels are literally at the gates of London. Mary's advisors are panicking, and this woman, who spent years being psychologically tortured, stands up and roars. She held up her coronation ring and declared herself married to England. She said she would live and die with her subjects. She turned a terrified crowd into a cheering mob ready to defend their queen. The same woman who had cowered before Anne Boleyn was now facing down armed rebels without flinching. The transformation was so complete it scared people. How does someone go from victim to victor that fast? How does a broken princess become an unbreakable queen? The answer was simple and terrifying. 20 years of abuse had taught Mary how to endure anything. When you've survived what she survived, leading an army seems easy by comparison. Today's influencers buy followers. Mary earned hers by surviving 2 decades of abuse and still standing. She didn't need Instagram to go viral. She just needed to finally say enough, and mean it. But her greatest test wasn't rebels at the gate or raising armies from nothing. It was the wedding night that would destroy her soul. Because when you've been broken and rebuilt yourself, the cruelest thing anyone can do is remind you that you're still just a woman in a man's world. Mary thought she'd finally found someone who couldn't betray her, a husband. But Philip of Spain's closest advisor literally wrote that his master needed tact and skill to deal with a woman from whom he could expect neither physical pleasure nor satisfaction. Yes, they actually wrote that down, in official diplomatic correspondence, about a reigning queen, and that was before Philip even met her. Picture the scene. Mary is 38 years old, has survived decades of abuse, commanded armies and secured her throne. She's never been kissed, never been courted, never experienced any form of romantic affection. Then comes Philip of Spain, 27 years old, considered one of the most handsome princes in Europe, and her cousin once removed. Mary falls in love with his portrait before she's even met him. The tragedy was already writing itself. The Spanish delegation's private letters about the match are absolutely brutal to read. Rui Gomez de Silva, Philip's closest confidant, wrote that Mary was older than we were told and thin and worn with no eyebrows. He actually noted that Philip would need to overcome his personal feelings for the good of Christianity. Imagine your future husband's best man writing that marrying you required overcoming disgust for religious reasons. Here's what most people don't realize. Philip's first words upon seeing Mary weren't recorded in the official chronicles, but his courtiers wrote home about his visible disappointment. One Spanish nobleman noted that Philip maintained his composure admirably when first presented to his bride. That's diplomatic speak, for he managed not to visibly recoil. The wedding at Winchester Cathedral on July 25th, 1554, was a masterclass in performed affection. Philip played the part of devoted bridegroom perfectly in public. He held Mary's hand, smiled at the right moments, and even attempted a few words in English. But behind closed doors, his household was already planning his escape. They were literally discussing how soon he could return to Spain without causing a diplomatic incident. But wait, it gets worse. The wedding night, something Mary had probably dreamed about through her lonely decades, was a disaster. Philip spoke only Spanish to his attendants, excluding Mary from conversations in her own chambers. When courtiers suggested he might show more affection to his new wife, Philip reportedly replied that he would do his duty as a gentleman. That's the romantic equivalent of, "I'll think of England and get through it." The really twisted thing? Mary was completely oblivious to his disgust. She wrote gushing letters about her most beloved husband and how God had blessed her with such a match. She would blush like a teenager when he entered the room. This 38-year-old queen who had faced down armies turned into a stuttering schoolgirl around a man who could barely stand to touch her. The documented evidence of Philip's coldness is heartbreaking. He would retire to separate chambers immediately after performing his marital duties. He surrounded himself with Spanish courtiers and conducted business in Spanish, effectively creating a foreign court within Mary's own palace. When forced to appear with Mary in public, he would stand just far enough away to avoid casual contact. Here's the truly disturbing part. Everyone could see it except Mary. English courtiers wrote about the Spanish prince's evident coldness toward their queen. Foreign ambassadors noted Philip's lack of enthusiasm for his wife. The entire court was watching this slow-motion humiliation, and Mary was the only one who didn't realize she was the joke. Philip's household accounts show he immediately started sending money back to Spain, not a good sign for marital bliss. He brought his own cooks because he couldn't stomach English food, but courtiers whispered he couldn't stomach his English wife either. He spent more time with his Spanish confessor than with Mary, leading to rumors about what exactly he was confessing. The public rejection was subtle but constant. At state banquets, Philip would engage in animated conversation with everyone except Mary. He would dance with her ladies in waiting, while she sat alone on the throne. He mastered the art of being physically present, but emotionally on another continent. Mary would reach for his hand, and he would pretend not to notice. But here's what's really messed up. Mary blamed herself. She ordered new dresses, thinking she wasn't attractive enough. She learned Spanish, thinking the language barrier was the problem. She prayed for hours, begging God to make her a better wife. This woman who had survived decades of abuse was now voluntarily subjecting herself to new tortures, thinking she could love Philip into loving her back. The bedroom situation was particularly cruel. Philip would arrive, do the minimum required to potentially produce an heir, and leave immediately. No tender words, no affection, just mechanical duty. Mary, who had never experienced physical intimacy, didn't know this wasn't normal. She thought all marriages involved crying yourself to sleep while your husband fled to another wing of the palace. Within months, Philip was making excuses to leave England. He claimed urgent business in the Netherlands, family obligations in Spain, anywhere but with his wife. Mary begged him to stay, actually getting on her knees in private to plead with him. The Queen of England on her knees, begging a man who found her repulsive to pretend to love her just a little longer. Imagine your Tinder date live streaming about how unattractive you are to his bros. Now imagine you're married to him. He's living in your house, spending your money, and you're still convinced he's your soulmate. That was Mary's reality. Except, instead of unfollowing and moving on, she had to maintain the facade for international diplomacy. Modern relationship experts would call this emotional abuse. Mary's contemporary subjects called it Tuesday. The Queen, who had learned to endure slaps from servants, now had to endure a different kind of blow, the daily rejection from someone she loved. But nothing prepared her for what her own body would do next. Because when you're desperate for love and validation, sometimes your mind creates what reality denies. For 11 months, Mary's stomach swelled. The court hired wet nurses. Baby clothes were sewn. An heir to secure everything she'd fought for was finally coming. Except there was no baby. Never had been. Her body had played the ultimate sick joke. And the really twisted part? This wasn't just a missed period or morning sickness. This was nearly a year of complete physical and psychological delusion that ended in the most public humiliation imaginable. September 1554 started with such hope. Mary missed her period and immediately announced she was pregnant. Finally, validation. Proof that God blessed her marriage, that Philip's coldness would melt when he held his child, that all her suffering had led to this moment. The entire country erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, bonfires were lit, and even Mary's enemies had to concede that a legitimate heir would stabilize England. Here's what most people don't realize. Mary's body provided every symptom of pregnancy. Her stomach swelled progressively. She experienced morning sickness so severe she could barely keep food down. Her breasts enlarged and became tender. She even felt quickening, the baby moving inside her, except there was no baby. Her desperate mind and traumatized body had conspired to create the ultimate phantom pregnancy. The court preparations were absolutely insane. They prepared a lying-in chamber with walls hung with tapestries depicting the Virgin Mary. Cradles were commissioned from the finest craftsmen. Wet nurses were selected and put on standby. Physicians were brought from across Europe. An entire wing of Hampton Court Palace was renovated for the future Prince of Wales. The documented expenses run to thousands of pounds, millions in today's money. Philip's reaction evolved from skepticism to hope to barely concealed mockery. Initially, he showed more affection to Mary than he had since their wedding. A pregnant wife meant he could leave England with honour once the heir was born. He even touched her swollen belly in public, performing the role of expectant father. But as months passed with no baby, his Spanish courtiers began making jokes about the English miracle that seemed to have no end date. But wait, it gets worse. By April 1555, Mary should have been delivering. Instead, her physicians kept pushing back the due date. First, they said she had miscalculated. Then they suggested the baby was positioned strangely. Then they mumbled about queens having longer gestations. The excuses became increasingly desperate as spring turned to summer with no infant appearing. The public humiliation was excruciating. Foreign ambassadors sent mocking dispatches home about the Queen who couldn't tell the difference between a baby and gas. Protestants whispered that God was punishing Mary for returning England to Catholicism. Even Catholics began to doubt. Was their Queen delusional? Was she lying? Was this divine judgment? Here's the truly disturbing part. Mary remained convinced she was pregnant, even as evidence mounted otherwise. In May, she withdrew into confinement, following the traditional ritual of queens about to give birth. She spent hours in labour pains that produced nothing. She interpreted every cramp, every movement, as signs the baby was coming. Her ladies didn't dare tell her the truth. The psychological torture was beyond comprehension. Imagine spending 9 months preparing for the most important moment of your life, feeling every symptom, having an entire nation watching, and then nothing. No baby, no explanation, just an empty cradle and a swollen belly that meant nothing. Mary would sit among the prepared baby clothes, touching tiny gowns that would never be worn. By June 1555, even Mary's most loyal supporters couldn't maintain the fiction. The swelling began to reduce. The movements stopped. Philip, showing spectacular cruelty, used this as his excuse to leave for the Netherlands. He couldn't even pretend sympathy for his wife's devastating loss of something that never existed. He left her surrounded by empty cradles and unused baby clothes. The aftermath was catastrophic for Mary's mental state. She emerged from confinement aged dramatically, her hair grey, her face drawn. She insisted she had been pregnant but lost the baby, even though no miscarriage occurred. Some courtiers reported she would be found in the nursery, rocking an empty cradle and singing lullabies to nothing. Modern medicine recognizes phantom pregnancy as a real condition called pseudocyesis. The mind wants something so desperately that it convinces the body to simulate pregnancy. For Mary, whose entire worth as queen and woman depended on producing an heir, whose husband might show affection if she gave him a son, the psychological pressure created physical symptoms. Her trauma literally manifested as a swollen belly. But here's what's really messed up. It happened again. In 1557, Mary convinced herself she was pregnant for a second time. The same swelling, the same symptoms, the same desperate hope. This time, fewer preparations were made. Courtiers exchanged knowing looks. Philip didn't even pretend to believe it. The second phantom pregnancy was barely acknowledged before it, too, disappeared into nothing. The empty nurseries became monuments to Mary's failures. Servants were ordered to pack away the baby clothes, but Mary would sneak in at night to touch them. She would hold tiny gowns to her chest and weep. The woman who had commanded armies was defeated by empty cradles and her own desperate imagination. Today we'd call it pseudocyesis and offer therapy. In Tudor England, it was God's judgment on a barren queen. The court that had celebrated her pregnancy now whispered about her madness. And when both God and your body betray you, when your husband flees and your womb remains empty, there's only one response that makes sense to a broken mind: fire. If Mary couldn't create life, she would become an expert at ending it. Here's what they don't teach in history class. Every Protestant Mary burned alive was really Anne Boleyn in her mind. 280 people turned into human torches because one woman's pain had nowhere else to go. And the really sick part? She prayed while they screamed. She genuinely believed she was saving their souls while destroying their bodies. The smoke from human flesh became incense for her twisted prayers. February 4th, 1555, marked the beginning of England's most horrific religious persecution. John Rogers, a Bible translator and father of 11, became the first victim of what history would call the Marian persecutions. But here's what most people don't realize. Mary didn't start with nameless peasants. She went straight for respected religious leaders, making examples of men who had spent decades serving God in their own way. The legal framework for these horrors was already in place. Medieval heresy laws allowed burning for religious crimes, but they'd rarely been used in England. Mary resurrected these dusty statutes with vengeful enthusiasm. She appointed bishops who shared her zeal for purifying England through fire. The truly disturbing part? She thought she was being merciful. Better to burn for minutes on earth than for eternity in hell, right? The process was systematically cruel. Accused heretics were given chances to recant. They were shown the instruments of their destruction: the stakes, the chains, the bundles of wood. Many broke down and converted back to Catholicism, but for those who held firm, the machinery of death ground into motion. Trials were shams, convictions predetermined, sentences carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. John Rogers died before a crowd of thousands at Smithfield. His wife and 11 children were forced to watch. Witnesses reported he washed his hands in the flames as if they were cold water, showing no pain until the very end. But wait, it gets worse. This courage in the face of death transformed executions from warnings into recruitment events for Protestantism. Every martyr created 10 more willing to die. The escalation was rapid and merciless. February saw 5 burnings, March saw 6. By summer, the fires burned weekly. Bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley were burned together in Oxford on October 16th, 1555. Latimer's last words to Ridley became immortal: "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out." Here's the truly disturbing part. Mary attended Mass while these executions happened. She would kneel in her private chapel, praying for the souls of those dying in agony across London. She convinced herself their screams were the sounds of demons leaving their bodies. The smoke drifting over the city was souls being purified. In her broken mind, she was a divine instrument of salvation. The victims weren't just theologians and priests. Ordinary people who refused to abandon their Protestant faith faced the flames. Women, teenagers, elderly citizens. The fire didn't discriminate. One particularly horrific case involved a pregnant woman who gave birth at the stake. The baby was thrown back into the fire. Even Mary's supporters were horrified, but she remained unmoved. Heretics bred heretics, after all. Thomas Cranmer's execution on March 21st, 1556, should have been Mary's greatest triumph. The archbishop who had annulled her parents' marriage declared her a bastard and enabled her father's break from Rome, finally facing justice. He had even signed a recantation. But in his final moments, Cranmer thrust the hand that signed his submission into the flames first, declaring his Protestant faith. Mary's victory turned to ash, literally and figuratively. The documentation of these atrocities is extensive and stomach-turning. We have accounts of victims singing hymns as they burned. Others prayed for Mary's soul with their dying breaths. Some took over an hour to die when the wood was damp. Executioners sometimes added gunpowder to speed death, but not always. The variations in suffering were part of the horror. You never knew if death would come quickly or slowly. But here's what's really messed up. Mary increased the burnings when Philip left England. The correlation is undeniable. When her husband abandoned her, more Protestants died. When her phantom pregnancy ended, the executions accelerated. She couldn't burn Anne Boleyn, who was already dead. She couldn't burn Philip, who was in Spain. But she could burn anyone who reminded her of the faith that had destroyed her family. The psychological projection was obvious to everyone except Mary. Protestant wives refusing to abandon their faith for Catholicism. They were Anne Boleyn refusing to abandon her ambition. Protestant ministers preaching against Rome. They were Cranmer annulling her mother's marriage. Every victim represented someone who had hurt her, and the flames were her therapy. The public turned against their queen as the burnings continued. They called her Bloody Mary, not to her face, but the nickname spread like wildfire. Catholic nobles begged her to stop, warning that she was creating Protestant martyrs faster than she could burn them. Foreign ambassadors reported England was one spark away from rebellion. Mary's response? More fire. Modern historians estimate 284 people died in the Marian persecutions over 3.5 years. That's roughly one person burned alive every 4 days. In some months, the rate was even higher. The smoke from Smithfield became a constant presence. The smell of burning flesh permeated London. Children grew up thinking human bonfires were normal. We cancel people on Twitter. Mary literally cancelled their existence with fire. We think public shaming is harsh. Mary made it fatal. But karma has a sick sense of humour, and Mary's own body was about to start its own burning process, from the inside out. Because when you spend years turning bodies into ash, sometimes the universe decides to return the favour. They say you reap what you sow. Well, Mary sowed fire and reaped something worse, her own body literally rotting while she was still alive. Patches of blackened, stinking flesh that no amount of perfume could hide. Even her death was a horror show that seemed scripted by a particularly vindictive cosmic playwright. The woman who burned others alive was about to experience her own body consuming itself from within. The first signs appeared in early 1558. Mary, now 42, developed what court physicians delicately called dropsy, massive fluid retention that made her appear pregnant yet again. But this time, everyone knew better. Her face and limbs swelled grotesquely. Her skin took on a yellowish tinge that makeup couldn't hide. The queen who had always been plain was becoming genuinely difficult to look at. Here's what most people don't realize. The symptoms suggest ovarian cancer, though Tudor physicians had no concept of such things. The tumours would explain her phantom pregnancies, her swollen belly, and now her body's complete breakdown. But the physical manifestation was so horrifically perfect, it seemed like divine judgment. The woman who burned Protestants was being consumed by internal fire. By summer 1558, the situation was undeniably terminal. Mary's skin began developing dark patches that wouldn't heal. These necrotic areas emitted a smell that perfume couldn't mask. Courtiers started finding excuses to avoid her presence chamber. Even her most loyal ladies-in-waiting struggled to hide their revulsion. The queen was literally rotting alive, and everyone could smell it. The psychological torture of physical decay hit Mary particularly hard. She'd always known she wasn't beautiful. Philip's rejection had made that crystal clear, but now she was becoming monstrous. Servants reported finding her staring at herself in mirrors, touching the blackened patches of skin with trembling fingers. The woman who had endured decades of humiliation was facing the ultimate degradation, to a body betraying her in the most visible way possible. But wait, it gets worse. As her body failed, Mary's mind began to fracture. She started hallucinating children playing in her chambers, the babies she never had, come to visit their dying mother. She would reach out to touch them, speaking to empty air about their pretty clothes and sweet faces. Witnesses described her cooing at nothing, rocking invisible infants, singing lullabies to shadows. The medical treatments were their own form of torture. Physicians bled her repeatedly, believing bad humors needed release. They applied leeches to the blackened skin. They forced her to drink concoctions of mercury and herbs that caused violent purging. Every cure was worse than the disease, adding new agonies to her final months. The smell of her sick room became legendary, a mixture of decay, medicine, and despair. Philip's response to news of his wife's condition was characteristically cold. He sent formal letters, wishing her recovery, but made no attempt to visit. He was already negotiating to marry Elizabeth of Valois before Mary was even dead. The Spanish ambassador reported Philip showed appropriate concern, diplomatic speak for the bare minimum of pretended care. Here's the truly disturbing part. Mary remained lucid enough to know she was dying horribly. Between hallucinations, she would have moments of crystal clarity where she understood her body was rotting, her husband didn't care, and her legacy would be one of blood and fire. She would beg God to explain why he was punishing her when she'd only tried to save souls. The prayers of a dying, delusional woman echo through history. The final weeks were a parade of horrors. The necrotic patches spread across her torso, tumors pressed against her organs, causing excruciating pain that no amount of opium could dull. She vomited constantly, unable to keep down even water. Her hair fell out in clumps. The strong woman who had faced down rebels couldn't even stand without assistance. November 1558 brought the final act. Mary drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes thinking she was young again, sometimes believing her phantom children were real. She would call for her mother Catherine, dead for over 20 years. She would beg Anne Boleyn for forgiveness, then curse her in the next breath. The past and present blurred into one long nightmare. On November 17th, 1558, Mary Tudor died at St. James's Palace. Her last coherent words were about Philip and Calais, the husband who abandoned her and the English territory lost during her reign. Even in death, she was focused on her failures. The woman who had commanded armies and burned heretics died thinking about rejection and loss. The autopsy results, such as they were, confirmed what everyone suspected: massive internal tumors. Her body was as corrupted inside as it had appeared outside. The physical decay seemed to mirror the moral decay of her reign. Protestant writers would later claim God had marked her body to match her soul. The poetry of her horrible death was too perfect to be coincidence. Witnesses to her final moments reported a smell so overwhelming that windows had to be opened despite November cold. The body that had never known love, had never carried a child, had never experienced tenderness, ended as a source of revulsion. Servants drew lots to see who had to prepare the corpse for burial. The queen who had made others burn died in a personal hell of decay and abandonment. Modern medicine could have saved her body. Nothing could have saved her soul. The treatments that might have extended her life didn't exist. But even if they had, would anyone have bothered? By November 1558, England was ready for Mary to die. The crowds that would mourn Elizabeth's death 45 years later celebrated Mary's. Bonfires lit for joy, not execution. The bloody queen was finally gone. But the ultimate insult was yet to come. Even death wouldn't free Mary from humiliation. Because when you've spent your life being betrayed by everyone you loved, why should death be any different? You'd think death would end Mary's suffering. Wrong. She wanted to be buried with her mother Catherine. Instead, she's stuck for eternity with Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, under a monument that doesn't even mention Mary's name. It's like being buried under your bully's Instagram memorial. The final betrayal came not from the living, but from history itself, which would erase her, even in stone. Mary's burial wishes were explicitly clear. Throughout her final illness, she repeatedly asked to be interred beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, at Peterborough Cathedral. It made perfect sense. The wronged wife and the destroyed daughter, reunited in death after being separated in life. But here's what most people don't realize. Elizabeth had other plans. and the dead have no voice to protest. The funeral itself was a study in minimalism, where her father Henry VIII had received weeks of ceremonies and her brother Edward VI was mourned with great pageantry. Mary got the bare minimum. December 14th, 1558, saw a modest procession from St. James's Palace to Westminster Abbey. The same nobles who had rushed to support her at Framlingham found convenient excuses to be elsewhere. The weather was bitter cold, and so was the atmosphere. Philip of Spain's reaction to his wife's death was documented in painful detail. His secretary wrote that the king received the news with moderate grief, as befitted a Christian prince. Moderate grief for his wife. He then immediately instructed his ambassador to sound out Elizabeth about marriage. Yes, you read that right. Philip tried to marry his dead wife's sister before Mary's body was even cold. But wait, it gets worse. The burial ceremony was conducted in Latin, as Mary would have wanted, but with none of the grandeur she deserved as queen. The coffin was plain, the mourners few, the prayers perfunctory. The woman who had restored Catholicism to England was being buried like a minor noble, not a monarch. Even her most devoted supporters seemed eager to move on. Here's the truly disturbing part. Elizabeth initially left Mary in her simple tomb. For 44 years, Mary lay in Westminster Abbey with just a basic marker. No grand monument, no elaborate epitaph, just a stone slab marking where a queen lay. Elizabeth, meanwhile, built her glorious reign literally on Mary's ashes, taking credit for the stability Mary's harsh rule had actually created. When Elizabeth died in 1603, James I a dilemma. Two queens, both claiming legitimacy, both childless, both part of the Tudor legend. His solution was spectacularly cruel to Mary. He had Elizabeth's body placed in the same tomb as Mary's, with a magnificent monument built above them. The inscription? It honours Elizabeth alone. Mary isn't even named on her own grave. The monument stands today in Westminster Abbey, a towering tribute to Gloriana, Elizabeth the Great, the Virgin Queen. Tourists photograph it daily, marvelling at the beautiful effigy of Elizabeth in her coronation robes. Below her lies Mary, unmentioned and unknown. The woman who had been forced to serve her baby sister in life now serves as her sister's mattress in death. The Latin inscription reads, Regno consortes et urna, hic obdormimus, Elisabetha et Maria sorores, in spe resurrectionis. Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection. But even this minimal acknowledgement is hidden, requiring visitors to look closely. The English inscription celebrates only Elizabeth's reign, her victories, her glory. Think about the psychological cruelty of this arrangement. Mary, who spent her youth being humiliated by Anne Boleyn's daughter, now spends eternity beneath Elizabeth's monument. The Protestant queen literally stands on the Catholic queen's bones. Every prayer said at the tomb, every flower laid, every tourist photo, all for Elizabeth. Mary is just the forgotten foundation. Modern historians have noted the bitter irony. Mary, who burned Protestants to save Catholicism, lies beneath the queen who made England permanently Protestant. Mary, who desperately wanted children, lies with her virgin sister. Mary, who craved recognition and legitimacy, remains unrecognized in her own tomb. It's as if the universe crafted the perfect final insult. But here's what's really messed up. The erasure was deliberate. James I could have built separate monuments. He could have honored both queens equally. Instead, he chose to make Mary invisible, even in death. The woman who had ruled England for 5 years was reduced to an unnamed body holding up her sister's glory. History written by the winners doesn't just favor them, it erases the losers entirely. Imagine being buried under a statue of your worst enemy, while your ex slides into their DMs. Imagine spending eternity as a footstool for the person who represents everything taken from you. That's Mary's reality. From miracle baby to rotting queen to forgotten ghost, her transformation was complete. The princess who had once worn cloth of gold now wears only obscurity. Visitors to Westminster Abbey today walk past Mary Tudor every day without knowing it. They admire Elizabeth's monument, take selfies with the Virgin Queen, and move on. Below, in the dark, lies the woman who endured chamber pot duty, phantom pregnancies, and death by internal fire. No flowers for Bloody Mary, no prayers for the forgotten queen, just eternal silence beneath her enemy's fame. The final statistics of Mary's life read like a horror novel. 20 years of psychological torture as a youth, 5 years of burning Protestants as queen, 280 people dead by fire under her rule, 2 phantom pregnancies that produced nothing but humiliation, 1 husband who found her repulsive, 0 children to carry on her name, and now 0 recognition, even in death. From princess to servant, to queen to monster to corpse to forgotten bones, Mary Tudor's transformation was complete. History remembers her only as Bloody Mary, a cautionary tale about religious extremism. But understanding her journey from that terrified teenager, emptying chamber pots, to the broken woman, ordering executions, reveals something more disturbing. Sometimes monsters aren't born. Sometimes they're meticulously crafted by the very people who later condemn them. The ghost of Mary Tudor doesn't haunt Hampton Court or the Tower of London. She haunts Westminster Abbey, where thousands daily celebrate her sister while standing on her unmarked grave. It's the perfect ending to a life defined by betrayal. Even death couldn't free Mary from serving Elizabeth. The princess, who started as a disappointment for being female, ended as a footnote for being forgotten. But perhaps the cruelest irony is this: Mary's suffering created Elizabeth's glory. The brutal executions turned England Protestant permanently. The Spanish marriage failure made Elizabeth's virginity politically powerful. The phantom pregnancies made Elizabeth's childlessness seem like choice, not tragedy. Every one of Mary's failures became a foundation for Elizabeth's success. The forgotten queen in the unmarked grave literally built the pedestal for Gloriana's eternal fame. So next time you complain about family dysfunction, remember Mary Tudor. Your siblings might steal your clothes or your boyfriend. Mary's sister stole her throne, her legacy, and even her grave. Your parents might play favorites. Mary's father destroyed her entire world for a male heir who died at 15. You might feel forgotten or overlooked. Mary was erased from her own tomb. The woman who commanded 15,000 men couldn't command 6 feet of stone with her name on it. The queen who burned 280 people alive couldn't keep her memory burning for even a century. From miracle princess to bloody queen to forgotten bones, Mary Tudor's transformation reminds us that sometimes the worst fate isn't death. It's being edited out of your own story. Today we're obsessed with leaving legacies, building personal brands, making sure we're remembered. Mary Tudor ruled England, changed history, and traumatized generations, and still ended up as an unnamed corpse beneath her sister's monument. Makes your worries about Instagram engagement seem pretty minor, doesn't it? The next time you're dealing with family drama, workplace humiliation, or romantic rejection, remember, at least you won't end up as an unmarked foundation for your enemy's monument. At least your suffering won't be literally carved in stone. At least when you're gone, someone might remember your name. Mary Tudor commanded armies, wore a crown, and changed England forever. But in the end, she's just the forgotten bones beneath Elizabeth's glory. From princess to prisoner to queen to monster to ghost, the complete transformation of Mary Tudor. Now that's what you never learned in history class.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.